Get excited, people. Today we're going to talk about var versus let in JavaScript. Let variables are one of the most useful features in JavaScript, and I heavily recommend that after you watch this video, you stay away from var variables. I think let variables are that good. To get the most out of this video, I recommend that you are fairly familiar with var variables and with functions. I want you to know what they are, I want you to know how to use them and all of that. If you don't have those prerequisites, feel free to head down into the description and I'm gonna put there a couple of videos for you to get the basics of JavaScript so that you can follow along better in this video. Let's get right into it, shall we? So to start this discussion, I like to introduce the concept of scope. Scope is one of the things that fundamentally change when you use var variables and when you use let variables. A definition that I like to use for scope is this one. Scope is the area of code where you can access a symbol. And symbol here may be kind of a computer sciencey word, but a symbol can be anything in this case. It could be a function, it could be a variable. The key point here is that scope is that area of the code where you can use that symbol, where you can use that variable, or when you can use that function. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about how this concept of scope looks like in real code. So I'm going to make a variable and I'm going to just say something like hello or hi. And the main point here is that if a variable can be used in a piece of code, I'm going to say that that variable is considered to be within scope. So if I say console.log variable and I can print its value, that basically means that that variable is within scope. So I could just copy this line anywhere in this file, and if you see the hi next to it, because my code is being run all the time, you know that the variable is considered to be within scope. So I can console.log this as many times as I want to, and you're going to see the same result just fine. But you're going to see that as soon as I start to try to console.log this variable, before I defined it, I get this weird undefined message. And there is a lot going on behind that undefined that you see right there that we're going to talk about in a different video. But the point that I'm trying to make right now is that if we think about it, we can say that the area of the code where we can use this variable that we just made, we can think about it as right here. From the point that we define it all the way downwards. It keeps going and going and going, right? So this is the area where our function, or sorry, our variable is within scope. Let me clear this and I'm going to remove all of these console.logs and I'm going to create a function. I'm going to say function. This is a function and I'm going to move my variable inside my function. Now, as soon as I try to log this variable outside of the function, I'm going to do it right here. Notice how we get this error right here, or we should get in this error right here. There we go. That says Kali is not defined. That is because Kali has been defined inside my function. And I could try to put this outside over here, but again, we get this Kali is not defined. This is because var variables have something that we know as function-based scope. I'm gonna write it right here. Function-based scope. Meaning you can use var variables everywhere in the function where you created them. So for example, let me close this. So if I move this inside my function and I call my function, this is important, this is a function over here, you're going to notice that I get the message Kali is cute. And it didn't break any of the scoping rules. So inside functions, if you are using a var variable, we say that the scope of it is everywhere in the function where you defined it. And that is the most important thing to understand about var variables and how their scope relates to functions. The interesting thing is that since we are talking about function-based scope, if I have an if statement right here, I can say, let's make something simple that doesn't really take away any attention from the code or from the function itself. I'm gonna say something simple like is 1 equal to 1. And I'm going to put my variable inside my if statement, right? And I'm gonna move this outside of, there you go. Take a look at how I can access my variable Kali outside of the if statement because var has function-based scope, meaning I can access that variable everywhere inside this function. So that basically means from line 6, from line 9, I have access to that variable. That's going to change when I change this variable to a let variable. Let me change it right now. As soon as I make that change, it says Kali is not defined immediately from the start. That is because let variables have what we know as block-based scope. Let me go back to my presentation and we can see right here how we're going from function-based scope into block-based scope. And the question now becomes, what is a block? So basically a block is everything that you can imagine that goes inside brackets in JavaScript. For example, let me take a look at my code again. Here, let me clear this. We have two different blocks. One block is the if statements right here, from these brackets to these brackets. And the other one is this one right here, from these brackets to these brackets. So we have two different scopes. Let's name this scope A and scope B. Since we defined Kali in scope A, we can only use it inside A. We cannot use it in B. Yeah? So let me move this over here, and you're going to notice from the start that since we defined it inside scope A and we're trying to log it right in the same scope, things work just fine. Now, what happens if I move Kali away from here and I put it inside the other scope? It still works. Let's talk a little bit about why that's the case. Well, we have two scopes again. The first scope is going to be from this place to this place, and the smaller one is going to be just inside the if statement, right? Since we defined Kali right here, we can use it everywhere inside that scope. And it just so happens that this console log is inside this inner scope right here, but is also considered to be within the bigger scope. Yeah, so basically, since we defined it inside that block, it's going to be able to be used everywhere inside that block. It doesn't matter that this is considered a different block. It happens to be inside the bigger block right here, and therefore we can use it. If we were trying to move this outside, it's still not going to be defined because that is considered to be a completely different scope. So let me go to my PowerPoint presentation. Now you know that function-based scope is going to be used when you use var variables, and then block-based scope is going to be used when you use let variables. What you are going to notice is that Functions tend to be bigger than blocks. A function is going to be your entire function, and that's going to be usually big. And then blocks are going to be something smaller, like if statements or for loops or while loops. And you could also have other functions as well, but you're going to notice that in general, blocks are going to be smaller than functions. So why is it a good idea to have something that's going to be scoped based on something smaller? Well, at least for this context, it is better to have a smaller scope. In many other concepts in life, it's better to be bigger, especially in fighting, by the way. But in this case, it is better to have a smaller scope. And that is because we are trying to avoid two things. We are trying to avoid name collisions and unintended changes. And the two of these things are very closely related to one another. So name collisions is going to happen when you have a variable, let's say that is called user. And then you cannot use the same variable as long as you are in the same scope for something else. That's when you have name collisions, when a name has been blocked, for example. And then unintended changes is that when you don't know that the name user has been used by someone else, for example, and you change it by mistake, thinking it's your own variable or thinking that it's a new variable that you're making. And you may be thinking, well, how is that going to happen? What happens is that sometimes projects become so big or teams become so big that it's a little bit difficult to coordinate sometimes. So it is better to preemptively fight these problems by trying to have scopes that are as small as we can make them. And that is why block scoping is going to be a little bit more safe than the bigger function scope. And just to drive this point home, let me show you another way in which let is going to protect us of unintended changes and name collisions. So let me go back to the code, and I'm going to move my console.log into the if. Oops, let me fix that. Okay, notice how the code is working just fine. And let's pretend that this code is becoming a little bit too big and we have a lot of lines of code right here. And then we are gonna, by mistake, we don't know that the name Kali is being used right now. And you say, hey, var Kali, let's make it equal to 2038. Okay, and I'm gonna console.log that same name. Boom. Notice how we are redefining the name Kali by mistake, or in this case I'm doing it, but it would be by mistake in a real project. And notice how there's no errors in the console. Everything is working just fine. Now let me change that to let. So I'm going to change the second Kali to let immediately. And from the get-go, I get this Kali has already been declared. And they're using the word identifier in here. It's what I call symbol in my definition, and it's also, you can think about it as a name. So it says, hey, the name Kali has already been declared. You cannot reuse it. Let's try to fix it by changing this var to let. See if that fixes it. No. Identifier Kali has already been declared. Now let's change this to var just to see what happens. And let's change this to var again. So even though we are basically changing everything about this variable, we're changing it to a string, from a string to a number, from the value is cute to the value 38. It is still working just fine, and that is another way in which let is going to protect you from unintended changes and name collisions. And I really recommend that from now on you use let in all the variables that you create. understanding that it's going to have block scope instead of function scope, and that is going to help a lot into preventing name collisions. But also, let is going to preemptively double check that you haven't tried to redefine the name that is being using in that program. And with that said, thank you very much for watching this video. I really hope it helps, and I really hope that you keep using, actually, I hope that you stop using var and now you move to let. I'm gonna make another video in the next couple of weeks about const that's going to take the concept of let and add a little bit more rules on top of that. So please subscribe to this channel, like this channel, press all the buttons that you see on the screen except unsubscribe. Have a nice night, have a nice rest of your day, and please wash your hands.